Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I wanted to go over my thoughts on Wake Island and how I've found ways to improve. Wake Island is probably one of those more true to Battlefield experiences like Sewer Reef in Battlefield 6 right now, and honestly my first few games on it were a lot rougher than I expected they'd be. The map is just huge, the objectives are spread pretty far apart, and there are vehicles basically everywhere. So if you're playing infantry and trying to run them from one objective to another like you would on the maps that we've been used to playing so far in Battlefield 6, there's a pretty good chance you're just getting picked off before you even get to where you want to go. But after spending some time on Wake Island, I found that the map becomes a lot more enjoyable once you stop trying to play it like the other smaller maps we've gotten used to in the game. So in this video, I'm going to go over how I think you can improve on this map, when to use vehicles, where infantry tends to work best, what weapons make sense, and even which game modes I think are better depending on how you actually want to play that day. Let's get into it. The most obvious and first thing I think you have to understand about Wake Island is that it's built first and foremost as a combined arms map. And I don't just mean tanks and jets, you've got tanks, helicopters, boats, jets, jeeps, ATVs, pretty much every type of vehicle has a reason to exist here. And that's important because of just how spread out everything is. One of the biggest problems I had when I first started playing was trying to move around the map entirely on foot, especially if you miss out on one of those starting vehicles and just get left behind. You capture an objective, you look at the next one, it's just so far, and by the time you get there, you've either been spotted by a vehicle, picked off by a sniper, or you arrive just in time for your team to lose that objective that you were trying to capture. So don't be afraid to use the vehicles that are just meant to get you from point A to point B. A Jeep or an ATV doesn't have to be a vehicle you're planning on using for a while. Sometimes its only job is just to get you across the map quickly, get you close to an objective, and then you jump out and continue on foot. I think that alone makes Wake Island start to feel dramatically better. And obviously use what you're comfortable with and experiment. This felt the most like a traditional Battlefield map from previous titles to me, giving you tons of sandbox opportunities to experiment and mess around. There are a lot of long sight lines, plenty of open ground, and a lot of opportunities to support your infantry from a distance, whether that's in a boat, jet, or helicopter. And logically, engineers are also incredibly useful here because you're going to be dealing with a lot of enemy armor and vehicles. So if you're somebody who normally doesn't play engineer very much, Wake Island is one of those maps where I think it's definitely worth giving it a try. And then of course you've got the jets and updates to the flying mechanics in Season 4. So if you're a good pilot, Wake Island definitely gives you tons of opportunities to make an impact. But even if you're not a great pilot, and I'm definitely not going to pretend that I am, I'd still recommend experimenting with them. Just understand that the airspace is going to be a major part of this match. Now, even with all of the extra cover that they've added in this version of Wake Island, I think this is where the map gets really interesting for infantry players. A lot of the map is still really extremely open, and that means you're not necessarily playing the same way you would on some of these other dense urban maps that we're used to playing on. You're going to have a lot more fights at medium and long range, so if you're running a weapon that's designed primarily for close quarters and you're constantly crossing open ground, you're putting yourself at a pretty big disadvantage. You don't necessarily need to become a full-time sniper, even just having a weapon that you're comfortable using at longer distances makes a huge difference. And this means controlling for recoil and precision, of course, and how well it handles for you. And if you actually enjoy sniping, this is probably one of the better maps for it. You've got these long sight lines, exposed players moving between objectives, vehicles moving across open terrain, and plenty of elevated positions where you can watch what's happening. There's one thing I'd keep in mind, and that's don't necessarily spend the entire game sitting in that one spot. The map is so large that you're sitting on one side of the island watching the same pieces of terrain for 5 minutes. You might have a great view, but you might not actually be helping your team very much, which is fine if you're just having fun, but if you want to try to help your team and kind of improve your overall gameplay, try to move with the fight. If your team is pushing an objective, find a position where you can support them. If the enemy starts pushing your position, of course relocate. And if there's a vehicle threat in your team, this is when having that right engineer or recon setup can really pay off. Now I don't want to make it sound like Wake Island is just one giant long-range shooting gallery. There are definitely areas where the fighting becomes much more close quarter oriented, and that's especially around certain objectives and points of interest. You can get some really good infantry fights, and these are the areas where I think your typical SMG, shotguns, carbines, and other close range weapons start making a lot more sense. So rather than picking one loadout and using it for the entire match, I think Wake Island rewards you for changing your approach depending on where you're actually fighting. So if I'm planning to fight around an objective with a lot of buildings and cover, I'm much more comfortable running something designed for those closer medium ranges. But if I'm going to be pushing across an open section of the map, I'm going to want something that can actually reach people. And this is probably one of the biggest takeaways I'd give casual players. Don't force yourself to use the same weapon setup everywhere you go in that match. The map is simply too varied, and if you're struggling with a weapon, sometimes the problem isn't necessarily the gun, you might just be using it in the wrong way or the wrong part of the map. And this brings me to probably the biggest point and the biggest difference that I've seen with this map is when you play with different game modes. So if you want the full Wake Island experience, the combined arms, vehicles, aircraft, boats, infantry, everything, I think Conquest is definitely the way to go. This is where the map really gets to show off what makes it different and what makes it feel like that traditional Battlefield experience. You've got the objectives spread across the island, vehicles moving between them, aircraft controlling the skies, and infantry fighting around these individual objectives. But if you're somebody who just wants to play infantry or really focus on that kind of close quarter combat, I think Breakthrough can actually give that to you on Wake Island as well. The Breakthrough naturally pushes the fighting into these specific areas, which means you're not constantly spending half the game running across the island. You're going to have more concentrated infantry fights, more predictable areas of engagement, and more opportunities to actually use your weapons without worrying about crossing half the map every time you die. And that's honestly what I'd recommend if you're coming into Wake Island thinking, I just want to play some Battlefield infantry, try Breakthrough first. Then once you're comfortable with the map, jump into Conquest and start experimenting with the vehicles in kind of that classic Battlefield experience. Looking back at my first few games, I think my biggest mistake was really just trying to play Wake Island like what we've gotten used to with the early Battlefield 6 maps. They kind of readjusted our expectation of what these maps should feel like, and the reality is I think Wake Island and Sewer Reef are really pushing us back to what Battlefield maps should feel like. You should be running to these different objectives, making sure you get in the vehicles, and making sure you engage in different types of fighting in this kind of sandbox-oriented gunplay and battlements. So I think we're going in the right direction, and I think this island, Wake Island specifically, really starts to get us in that game mode and those thoughts. So if I had to boil everything down to a few simple rules for playing Wake Island, this is what I'd recommend. Number one, of course, use vehicles. You don't have to become a tank or a jet person, but even a Jeep or ATV can save you a huge amount of time getting around the map and can make you very effective in helping your team capture objectives and ultimately win the match. Number two is bring something that can fight at range. There are too many long sight lines to completely ignore long-range gunfights. Number three is change your loadout depending on where you're planning to fight. Close-range weapons are great around certain objectives, while the DMRs, the ARs, LMGs, and snipers can be much more useful across the open sections. And number four, definitely play as engineered if you're comfortable with it. There's so many vehicles on this map that you can get a ton of value out of anti-vehicle equipment and also help repair some of your team's vehicles. And finally, pick the right mode. If you want the full combined arms experience, play Conquest. If you want more concentrated infantry fighting, play Breakthrough. I think across both you can get a good balance of both types of gameplay, but they definitely focus on one over the other depending on that game mode that you choose. Wake Island has definitely took me a while to figure out, but I think that's also what makes it interesting. It's not really a map where you can just run around using the exact same strategy you use on every other Battlefield map. You really have to pay attention to where the fighting is happening, use the vehicles around you, and be willing to change your loadout depending on the situation. And for casual players, I think that's probably the biggest takeaway. Don't try to fight Wake Island on its terms, adapt to it. If you've been playing Wake Island, let me know what you've been running and what you found works best for you. And as always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like and subscribe if you want to see more. Be sure to spread some positivity, and I'll see you in the next one.